Safe harbor. The night Kai Nakamura swam through 8-foot waves to rescue 3 strangers from a capsizing sailboat, I was 40 feet above the street, straddling the roof of my cafe with a borrowed chainsaw, trying to cut and drop a maple branch before it fell through my front window on its own. Seattle was having exactly that kind of year. The kind of May where the National Weather Service ran out of polite words and just started calling things historic. I didn't know his name yet. I just knew there was a Coast Guard rescue boat cutting through Shilshole Bay, scanning the water with its spotlight. And somewhere in that light was a silhouette that didn't look like it belonged to the storm. A person moving as if he had made friends with the waves a long time ago. I had focused all my attention on him. I could say I was watching him breathlessly. As for him, he seemed to be at one with the waves. I should back up. My shop is called Salt and Bloom. 2 blocks from the marina in Ballard, it sits in a 100-year-old building that used to be my abuela's, grandmother's, flower stand before it was anything else. She used to sell dahlias to fishermen heading out to sea and sell them to them again when they returned. The second batch would be a little more faded, a little cheaper, but somehow always exactly what a man needed after 2 weeks at sea. When she died, I turned the flower stand into a cafe because I didn't know how to let go of the building, and I didn't know how to sell flowers either. I kept her name on the awning. I kept her photograph by the register. Everything else I built with my own hands, mug by mug, at 4:30 in the morning, for exactly 6 years. I was not built for hurricanes, atmospheric rivers, bomb cyclones, whatever they were calling it. I was built for oat milk and small talk, not for standing on a roof 11 at night with a chainsaw I had borrowed from my neighbor Theo an hour ago, and had only used twice in my life. The branch fell. I fell faster badly, right into a hedge that broke nothing but my pride. And that's when I saw the flare. Not a firework, a flare. That ugly, urgent red that means someone in the water has run out of better options. It came from beyond the breakwater, low, where the marina's private dock stretches out into the bay, and it lit up the underside of the clouds for a second, as if the sky had a heartbeat. I notified the authorities. Then I did the thing that, looking back, I tell myself anyone would have done. For no logical reason I can defend, I grabbed Theo's old kayak paddle and ran toward the water instead of away from it. Especially right after saying I was built for oat milk and superficial conversations, the stranger in the waters. I couldn't get far. The Coast Guard boat was already moving. They must have noticed it before I did. And within minutes their spotlights found the wreck. A 30-foot sailboat, the Henrietta, rolled half onto the rocks, its mast snapped, and a family of 4, somewhere in that mess of fiberglass and pitch-black water. That's when I saw him jump into the water. Rather than jumping, he disappeared. 1 second, he was a silhouette on the deck of the rescue boat. The next second, he was lost in the wave trough. And I remember thinking, with the specific stupidity of someone who has never done anything brave in their life, that the water was trying to kill him, and he looked like he was completely unaware of the situation. He surfaced twice, each time with someone next to him. The third time, the boat had to throw him a rope because his own strength was running out, and when they pulled him up, he was holding on to an 11-year-old boy whose shivering hadn't stopped, which was the bad kind of not stopping shivering. I didn't know his name yet, but watching him get pulled in over the gunwale and immediately start performing CPR on a kid half his size while the wind tried to tip the boat sideways, I knew I had just watched the bravest thing I would ever see in my life, and that I would remember every second of it, whether I wanted to or not. I want to tell you the part that scared me even more than the flare, more than the boy's bruised lips. It's this. The road to Swedish Hospital was already underwater. The rescue boat's radio had taken in salt water and was dying in real time. And somewhere 4 blocks east, the transformer I had been yelling at the power company about earlier finally blew, and Ballard was suddenly plunged into darkness, as if someone had pulled the plug on the whole neighborhood. They needed somewhere dry, somewhere warm, somewhere close. Before I had even finished my thought, I was standing on my own doorstep, waving a flashlight like an idiot, yelling that I had a wood stove, dry towels, and a 400 square foot space, about 37 square meters, that wasn't currently underwater. The cafe turned field hospital. That is how Kai Nakamura walked through the doors of my cafe for the first time. His waterproof dry suit soaking wet, carrying a boy who had started breathing again but was hanging on by a thread, scanning my dining room with his eyes in under 2 seconds. With that same look I would later learn he used to scan every room, looking for exits, looking for threats, looking for anything that could go wrong before it did. Towels, he said. Not hello. Not thank you. Just towels. Like a man who had no room in his head for anything that wasn't urgently useful. I had never moved so fast in my life. It was only after I dropped an armful of towels into his hands that I really looked at him. Really looked at him. The way you do when that adrenaline lands somewhere safe. Kai Nakamura was 25 years old, built exactly the way his job had purposefully built him. His shoulders were broad in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with the gym, but with the currents he had fought and won against. His hair was pitch black and cut very short, plastered flat with seawater, and even though he himself was soaking wet and shivering from the cold, his hands didn't falter once. There was a solidity to his face. Dark eyes, a jaw fixed somewhere between exhaustion and a refusal to give up, that made him look like the kind of person that rooms involuntarily organize themselves around. I am, by trade, someone who makes a living reading strangers. Reading who's having a bad day, who needs that good cocoa instead of small talk. And I read him in about 4 seconds. A man who had spent his whole life learning to be. The person who was there, running to help, and hadn't yet figured out how to let someone else be there for him. For the next 40 minutes, Salt and Bloom stopped being a cafe and turned into something closer to a field hospital. Kai laid the boy, whose mother had sobbed the name Mateo, into my shoulder before I even learned it, on the long table by the window, stripped off the kid's wet clothes with a brisk and unashamed efficiency, and wrapped him in every towel, apron, and tablecloth I owned. Meanwhile, he narrated his own actions in short, clipped sentences that I understood were more for him than for me. A way to keep his hands steady. He's breathing on his own, pulse is fast but beating. The problem isn't the lungs anymore, it's body temperature. While his parents, Aina and Renzo, sat shivering in front of my pastry case, their teenage daughter Carmen held a flashlight with hands that wouldn't stop shaking no matter how tightly she gripped it. I made the only thing I had the ingredients and a working stove for. Hot cocoa. 4 mugs of it, the good cocoa I saved for those slow Sunday mornings. Because my instincts told me that whatever was going to happen in my shop that night, it should at least smell like comfort. Kai didn't look up when I placed the mug by his elbow. Thanks, he said, and drank half of it in one gulp without seeming to notice it was hot. The wind was hitting the building like something holding a grudge. My front window, the big one, the one with Salt and Bloom written in gold letters, the one I had watched my abuela wash every Sunday of my childhood, bent visibly inward, and for a full second, I was sure I was about to watch 6 years of my life blow out into the street. That's not going to hold, Kai said. He had noticed it before I did. Of course he had. It's held through worse. Has it held through this, though? I didn't have an answer for that, because nothing in Seattle had ever held through this before. Together we dragged my heaviest table towards it, both of us soaking wet by then. Him from the bay, me from running back and forth to the storage room, and for a second our hands were on the same tabletop, close enough that I could feel how cold his fingers still were, even after the cocoa, even after the towels. Do you always do this? I asked him. Swim into things that are trying to drown you? He looked at me for the first time like I was a person and not a logistics problem. Only the ones that are worth it. I didn't have an answer for that. I just remember thinking that his eyes, even exhausted, even half frozen, were doing something in my chest that had nothing to do with the storm. The second rescue. But that wasn't even the part that scared me the most. Toward midnight, while Mateo slept restlessly under 3 layers of my best dish towels and his parents finally stopped shivering enough to doze sitting up, Kai's radio, which was already half dead from the salt water, crackled with one last announcement before dying completely. A fishing boat named Marisol, with 2 crew members, half a mile north of where the Henrietta sank, experiencing engine failure and drifting toward the rocks. His own rescue boat had taken hull damage while pulling the family aboard. It wasn't going back out. Not in this weather. I watched something I instantly recognized appear behind his eyes, because I had felt the exact same thing 2 hours earlier watching that flare rise. The specific, stupid pull of knowing someone out there needed help and being the only person close enough to offer it. "There's no boat," I said, before he could say anything. "Tell me there's another boat." There is no other boat. He was already pulling the hood of his dry suit back over his head with soaking wet arms, as if the storm hadn't spent the last 2 hours trying to tear him apart. Kai. It was the first time I used his name. I had heard the dispatcher say his name twice over the radio, and I felt it hook into me like something I hadn't asked for. "You can't swim half a mile in this weather." "I'm not going to swim." He gestured with his head toward the back of my shop, toward the storage room where, behind 6 years' worth of flour sacks and broken patio chairs, sat the one possession of my grandfather's I had never had the heart to sell. A 14-foot aluminum skiff, older than me, the one he used to take out beyond the breakwater on calm mornings before his hands got too bad to hold a fishing rod. That hasn't been in the water for 8 years. "Does it float, though?" "I don't know." "Then we're about to find out." I want to be honest about why I went with him. It wasn't courage. It was when he said "we," assuming without even asking that I would be in that skiff beside him. It touched something inside me that I still can't fully explain. Can only say it felt like being chosen for something for the first time in much longer than I wanted to admit. We dragged that skiff 4 blocks through knee-deep, stagnant water as we passed by a tree split clean down the middle, by a stop sign flattened against a fence. Carmen was holding the flashlight from the door of my shop, screaming that we were both crazy. We probably were. The bay, when we finally reached it, looked less like water and more like something alive and angry. And for a full second, while lowering that skiff into the water, I thought, this is how I die. And the last thing I will have done with my life is meet a man whose name I learned 3 hours ago. Then Kai placed his hand flat against my chest. Not romantic, not yet. Just a steadying, human touch. And said, "Stay low. Row when I say row. And don't look at the waves. Look at me." And somehow, that was enough to stop my hands from shaking. We found the Marisol 40 yards off the rocks. Its 2 crew members were tied to the mast, screaming themselves hoarse trying to drown out an engine noise that wasn't there anymore. It took 3 tries to get a rope to them and cost me most of the skin on my left palm. Getting them inside without flipping the skiff took everything Kai had left, and some things I didn't know I had at all, apparently including my ability to hold a boat steady with my entire body weight while a 40-year-old fisherman named Hector vomited seawater into my lap and thanked me in 3 languages. Our return to the dock was entirely out of pure luck and thanks to Kai's arms, which were shaking so much by that point that he could barely even tie the rope. At 2 in the morning, my shop housed 9 people instead of 5. My wood stove was burning its last logs, and the storm, finally, mercifully, had started to lose its temper. The aftermath of the storm. Kai was sitting on the floor with me next to the stove. We were both wrapped in the same itchy emergency blanket, the only dry one left, our shoulders touching in a way that went beyond the kind of coincidence you don't talk about out loud. "You don't have to tell me," I said, because he had gone quiet in a way that felt heavier than exhaustion. "But you dive into things as if you're trying to prove something. Or like you're trying to make up for something." He stayed silent for so long that I thought I had crossed a line. Then, my older brother drowned when I was 16. A kayak trip, nothing dramatic, just a current nobody took seriously enough. I was on the shore. I watched the whole thing, and I couldn't do anything because I didn't know how to swim well enough to help him. He turned the empty cocoa mug in his hands as if it were the most interesting object in the world. So I learned. Then I learned more than that. Then I realized that if you become the person who runs to help instead of the person standing on the shore, you could get paid for it. I didn't say I'm sorry, because years of customers crying into their lattes about dead parents and ended marriages had taught me a long time ago that being sorry doesn't do anyone any good. I just pressed my shoulder a little harder against his. Instead, I said, "This shop used to be my Bola's flower stand." She used to say a shop isn't just a building, it's a promise you keep showing up for every day. I think I kept it open after she died, because I didn't know how to keep a promise to someone who wasn't there anymore. Tonight was the closest I've come to losing it. But somehow, It's also the only night it felt like it was actually good for something. Kai looked at me then, with a look that had no professionalism left in it. "Are you seeing anyone?" he asked, completely out of nowhere, as if the question had been waiting behind his teeth for hours for an opening. Despite everything, despite the cocoa stains and the seawater still drying in my hair, I laughed. "I run a cafe in Ballard. I open at 5 in the morning. On my last date, the guy got up and left the table while the appetizers were arriving because my phone wouldn't stop ringing about a broken espresso machine." "That's not a no." "That's not a no," I agreed. He didn't kiss me then. The room was too full of strangers, shivering teenagers, and a man named Hector who still smelled like a fish hold. But he found my hand under the blanket, careful of the rope burn on my palm, and held it like it was something he intended to keep holding. The kiss happened at 5:40 in the morning in the doorway of my own shop, in that gray nothing light right before dawn, as the storm turned into an ordinary rain, and the sound of an ambulance finally climbing up my flooded street for Mateo played in the background. Aina hugged me so tight she nearly knocked me over onto Kai, and when I turned to balance myself, he was already there. Closer than the moment required, and neither of us pulled away. "I should go," he said, without moving. "I have a report to fill out. I have a boat to explain to my commander, and a dry suit that smells like your storage room." "You should go," I agreed, also without moving. He kissed me like a man checking one last time whether something that looked terrifying from a distance was just as good up close. Careful at first, then not careful at all. His hand was on my jaw, and my fingers were locked onto the dry suit that had survived 2 rescue operations and was about to survive something completely different. When he finally pulled back, for the first time all night, he looked like someone who didn't know exactly what to do. "I normally don't do things like this," he said. "You don't go on rescue missions in stolen skiffs." "That, and this part." He pointed between us, helplessly. He was 25 years old and had drifted deeper on land than he ever had in the water. "I'll come back, when the street's clear. I want to—" He paused, started over. "I want to come back when no one is drowning." "The cocoa will be ready," I said. "The best kind." "After everything." He came back 4 days later, when the power was back on and the streets were dry. A hand-painted sign hung in the window of Salt and Bloom that read, "Closed during ESTORM. OPEN FOR everything AFTER." He sat at my counter for 3 hours doing absolutely nothing but watching me work and getting in the way of my regulars. And I had never in my life been so glad to have someone in my way. By spring, Mateo's family had become regulars too. Ana brings me dahlias from her own garden now, just like my abuela used to do, and refuses to take money from me for even a single one. On slow mornings, Hector still drops off whatever gets caught in his nets, placing a paper-wrapped fillet on my counter with the same gruff greeting every time, as if the debt of that night would never be settled, no matter how much salmon changed hands. Carmen got her boating license the following summer, and she enjoys reminding me loudly in front of customers that, technically, she's more qualified to be on the water than either of us were that night. Kai's crew started dropping by Salt and Bloom after shift changes, until half of my afternoon regulars were off-duty Coast Guard officers in civilian clothes, arguing over card games at my corner table. I told him once that he had turned my abuela's flower stand into a break room for rescue swimmers. He just shrugged and said the coffee was better than the one at the station, which is true, but at the same time, as we both know, that is definitely not the real reason. 8 months later, it's the middle of summer now. The bay is flat, calm, and looks nothing like the night we met. He still smells faintly of salt water no matter how long he's been off shift. And I learned that the man who once told me he didn't usually do things like this does it constantly, every day. In every small way a person can knowingly and willingly choose someone. Showing up at 4:50 a.m. with the second key I gave him, fixing the front window himself instead of calling. A contractor. Learning to make my grandmother's cocoa from memory, because I only told him the recipe once, and apparently he doesn't forget the things that are important to me. The security camera above my register, The one I installed mostly to catch people stealing change from the tip jar, has a timestamp in the corner, and if you rewind the 8 months of footage to a Tuesday morning a few weeks ago, you would see it. Off-duty Kai Nakamura, sleeves rolled up, leaning toward my counter to place a small ring box near the register with the resolute but slightly nervous attention of a man who pulls people from drowning boats without batting an eye but is, for once in his life, completely terrified. Right as I walk out from the back with a tray of pastries in my hands and am about to drop all of them, the timestamp reads 05:47, 12 a.m. I said yes before he even finished his question.